Many of you will know that I built Moonlight from Huon pine back in Tasmania in about 1991. As a young man of about 21 years old, building a wooden boat would have been way beyond my capacity without the mentorship of John Philp. Throughout the 50s, 60s and 70s, John built many boats, some of which were for the scouting movement. If I were to name a favourite, Sarah Ann would be the one that comes to mind. I recall sitting on the beach at the fisheries at Coles Bay, watching John back his trailer down into the water at low tide, then sitting back on the beach with the rest of us as the incoming tide lifted her gently off her trailer. I could never imagine that 12 years after moving up to Queensland, that fate would intervene and I would again come across Sarah Ann, this time here on the Sunshine Coast. Sarah Ann has lost none of her appeal in the intervening years. Jace Roscoe is a young man with a passion for wooden boats. Jace had the wisdom to rescue Sarah Ann from life dwelling in a shed for the past 12 years not seeing the light of day. You just never know what's around the corner, and Jace had an opportunity that came up that meant he wasn't going to be able to complete the project of restoring Sarah Ann to her former glory and getting her back on the water. So he gave me a call. I'd just completed structural part of restoring Saffron, my Sunmaid 20. In fact, I was sitting on the water on the first little shakeout putt-putt around the bay when the phone rang. I needed no time at all to think about it. The thought of having Sarah Ann and doing her up in my yard on the Sunshine Coast was just absolutely exhilarating. I have a great admiration for Jace as a young man of just 19 and owner of now 4 wooden boats, starting off with his Cuda boat. I'm sure this was a very difficult decision for him, but he has an unwavering commitment to pursuing his destiny with wooden boats. So just when it was looking as if I'd be back on the water having a sail, it all started with removing some of the things which should just never have been put there in the first place. I now have Moonlight, my little 12-foot dinghy, which has a rig that was built originally by John. And I can lay claim proudly to a collection of 2 Philp boats, Moonlight and Sarah Ann, soon to become Clair de Lune, which in French means moonlight. There is a certain beauty in decay, and the weathered surface of this 60-year-old centre plate is like a moonscape. There may not be any wisdom in restoring this old bit of steel. It's obviously not going to be very efficient, and the centre case has a slot which is 19mm wide, and one of the challenges that I have is getting enough ballast low down in the boat. So I'm thinking about putting a 16mm plate of steel to replace the 6mm one that was the original. I am told that she's very tender, and that's something I'll improve. I must say, while I've enjoyed restoring the fiberglass boats, I'm not missing the dust and the toxic fumes and the prickles at night of working with fiberglass. Instead, I'm enjoying the swish of a well-sharpened plane sliding across the surface of ancient Huon pine. I'm reinstating this keel uphaul setup, and when this boat was built, I imagine this would have been galvanised wire, so it's been replaced at some stage, and it's way too thick and heavy, difficult to work with, so I'm replacing it with Dyneema because it's the best product for it. So easy to work with, pleasure to use, and once you learn the splices, which just a little bit of education required there, it's so much better. So we've got a anchorage point here, which I'll cut that off in a minute with the angle grinder, and then down through the pulley and up through, and I've bought a little sheave block, so a little sheave block there which I'll set. Let's see if I guess that size. Okay, yeah, perfect. So I'll set that about there, and that means that the pressure will all be shear force running in that direction, and run that up to the winch there. I can see it used to go about like that, so it would have had some kind of, the piece that was sitting on here, the capping piece on top of the centre case, was destroyed in the process of removing it prior to me getting the boat. Old Huon pine is quite brittle when you take it apart, so it's going to shatter, and I'm just looking at it thinking this is probably a better angle to come at through here. So I've made up a little bit of a toggle bolt there on a bit of 9mm stainless steel threaded rod, a shackle on the end of it, so this will sit through. Big washer on that end, and I'm sure that's the right thread, it's just a bit burred on the end. Okay, there you go. So there's the toggle bolt, so that'll sit through down in this section here, running through this way, and it will be the lower anchoring point, so I'll splice this onto here, and then that'll be lower anchoring point sitting on there inside the case. Now what that does is, the previous anchoring point was here, which meant that you had, it was on the back here like this, and what that meant was that you had anchorage point there down round the turning block on the keel itself and back up, so you had two lines running down through here, and I want to reduce it to one without changing the geometry, of course. So this stuff, depending on what you read, 10 times stronger than steel or something, but you know, we know that it's stronger than the equivalent thickness in steel, and that's what we're doing. So it was here, like that, round the turning block and up like so onto the winch, and that meant that you had to have a slot in here. I didn't actually see the capping piece that came off, but it would have had a slot there to take both those, and also to allow for the movement forwards as it pivots down over the bolt, pivot bolt, which is down in the keel there. So what we're doing here is we're going to run back through this way, down a bit lower, and along here, and it'll come up through the sheave block, and I've just got to make my mind up. Now there's the winch there. So I'd be better off actually lowering the winch, wouldn't I? Have a look at that. Yeah, if I actually lowered that winch and got that angle down here somewhere. Now I've got to think about whether that's going to interfere with something else and whether it's going to be easy to use. Look, to be honest with you, it would be great if you could raise and lower the winch from the cockpit. It makes me very anxious, just the thought of drilling a hole in one of John's boats, because when he built it there were precisely the right number of holes, and fortunately this boat has not had too many new ones drilled in it. But to think in terms of improving the design of something that John built, it's beyond me really. It's presumptuous. However, I think I've come up with a better way. I bought myself a new set of chisels. My son gave me a voucher at Bunnings. Most of my, well, all my good chisels over the years have either been lost, mislaid in some cases, or the ones that I've got left are more like cold chisels than chisels. So I need to do a locking splice on this. I need a smaller fid than that. Adding the sheave block here, which I don't think was part of the original setup, I've moved this point forward from here, which means that the winch is pulling almost vertically. And by the time I screw the capping piece on here, it'll hold this down, so it'll be fastened with 4 big fasteners and butyl mastic bedding, so it definitely won't be popping up. These screws here are quite long, 1.5 inches I think they are, so I think that will be fine. And the centerboard is not that heavy anyway, so over the top of that goes this little masterpiece. Do you recall when I salvaged a piece of Huon pine out of my wife's bedhead to replace a tiller that we lost on the old boat Moonlight? Well, I took a little piece off here at the time, and since acquired another Huon pine boat, so got some repairs to make, and Huon pine is too precious to be used in old bed heads. If you find any of these down in Tasmania, they were made in the 90s, maybe late 80s, and a tremendous amount of really beautiful Huon pine went into some very questionable household furniture. Originally, the capping piece was sealed with a combination of red lead and hemp. It had dried to become quite brittle, and I think it might have been a source of some of the leaks. So I've started using butyl mastic tape. It has that traditional feel to it, and it doesn't allow me to remove the capping piece, which I've used stainless fittings with Phillips head screws in. I know some people won't like that, but in order to maintain that keel cable, I may need to take it off at some stage.